The end was coming, the end of the world.
Judgment Day. Religious leaders throughout the ages have employed the fear of God to bring disciples to their knees, as Roch Thériault did in Quebec in the late 1970s.
So that's why, he had a good reason to make us believe that, we are special and we have to believe that, and we're the lucky one who will be saved,
Saved from the wrath of ancient prophecies, perhaps, but now living in fear of the most punishing cult leader of modern times. Seemingly normal people, complicit in savage mutilations, even the deaths of their babies. As with so many misguided seekers, the spiritual journey of Gabrielle Lavallée didn't start out that way. 30 years ago, an entire generation was on the move, turning away from a society they thought was heading in the wrong direction.
People are searching. You're also looking at a period, 60s, 70s, which were a period of exploration, spiritual, communal lifestyles, and so I think those are factors that come into play, and you have the desire to change the world and make the world a better place.
Gabrielle was looking to change the world, or escape it, and for good reason.
I was deeply handicapped. I was sexually aggressed when I was very young, a traumatism too hard to handle for my age, so I totally obliterated from my memory. But still, the damage was done.
These would be like lost souls. These would be like people who had nobody or maybe homeless or whatever, and here were some people who were willing to help. It was also an age too, where everyone was getting into like guru type of lifestyles and, alfalfa sprouts and, the whole wheat bread. And so they seemed like normal at the time.
If Gabrielle Lavallée was lost, she also had hope that she would find her way in the nursing profession, but not until she felt more sure of herself.
I was wondering who I really was. I was wondering hurt. I was wondering where I was coming from, and all of that misery, saying to myself, no matter what I touch, everything, becomes a failure. Why?
Depressed nearly to the point of suicide, Gabrielle gravitated to a lecture series run by the Seventh-day Adventists, held at a summer camp north of Toronto.
I said, I'm going to go there. Who knows? Perhaps there will be a direction for my future, a direction to follow.
She heard a preacher, a man who claimed he was in personal communication with God, a man named Roch Thériault.
Car sa puissance de sa colère va tout détruire ce que votre œil peut voir maintenant.
I felt someone looking at me in such a way that I had the feeling that his look was like transpercing me. I never, felt such a look before. So I asked to one of the people who were with him to fix an encounter, and the sooner the better.
People really kind of sometimes have this view that don't look in a leader's eyes or they'll zap you, and in some way they'll put you totally under their spell, like the kind of image one has of the zombies that are out there. And it's not really like that. I often look at it more as like kind of a love relationship. It's like kind of you fall in love. And you often hear the expression, love is blind. And in many ways, I think there's a process that goes on that is similar to that. It's like, wow, it's amazing. I've never had this happen to me in my life before. These are the most wonderful people. They're involved or care about the same things I do.
Gabrielle listened closely to this charismatic preacher and his vision of opening a healing center. If she didn't immediately volunteer, it wasn't due to any misgivings about him.
I didn't have very much confidence in myself. I didn't believe in myself. I didn't love myself.
She didn't have to, because this guru's outlook was positively infectious.
Well, a lot of people who met Roch thought he was one of the funniest born entertainers they'd ever met.
Perhaps no one has heard more stories about Roch Thériault than investigative journalist Ross Laver.
He would walk into a bar and have people in stitches. He was a prankster. He's kind of a natural-born showman, I suppose you could say. A lot of people became convinced, including professionals, psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, that Rock was a brilliant and kindly man of the Bible who only meant good.
Good intentions are rarely enough to seduce a listener, which is why Thériault had a plan of action.
Rock had gathered around him about a dozen young people. Some of them were, many of them were school dropouts, people not doing anything with their life, looking for some sense of purpose. And Rock wanted to keep them busy and keep them around him, so they set up a natural food clinic, and he sort of presented himself to the public as a homeopathic healer.
Armed with a nursing degree, Gabrielle could assist Thériault, and likewise, his proposed wellness center would allow her to serve others.
Well, he asked me, why don't you become an associate with me, you know? You want to feel yourself useful, you want to be happy. Well, perhaps this is the chance of your life. And I said to myself, yeah, that might be very well the chance of my life.
Mike Kopfeld has heard it all before. He runs InfoCult, a clearinghouse for information on new and strange religious movements.
Many people who join groups, you know, and in the case of Thériault also, have what they see as kind of a conversion experience, is they meet the group and it's like, wow, you know, this is what I've been looking for. They have this incredible high. And because they feel that they've gotten this incredible high because of the leader, they say, thank you. It's because of him that I was able now to achieve this kind of, you know, sense of self or spiritual awakening. And it's now, thank you, what's my next step?
The step was almost biblical, a journey to remote eastern Quebec to build a commune. They thought they were following their star, but it would become a black hole from which they could not escape.
What he built around us is the worst jail that could ever exist, because we don't see the bars. It's a psychological jail. A total control on our mind.
Every once in a while, someone issues a public warning worth listening to. Gabrielle Lavallee is just such a person. You might say she gave her right arm so that we could avoid the same costly mistake.
If you ever meet a man, we promise you, you know, I mean, the heaven on earth, and you think that you will live the most beautiful life, you know, you will reach a nirvana on earth, and you say to yourself, it's impossible, it's too beautiful to be true. Well, yeah.
Gabrielle is wiser now, but in the summer of 1978, she was one of 16 young Quebecers who surrendered everything, even their individuality, to join a religious maverick named Rock Thériault.
Rock made a break, and he packed up all of his meager belongings and all of his sort of ragtag band of young people and headed off into a remote part of the Gaspé Peninsula, and out of nothing built a big log cabin large enough for about a dozen people.
So we were living in tents and getting up very early and to build. And to build very fast, because, you know, the Gaspésian winters are very harsh and they arrive quite early also.
My understanding is they were living together as a group, and everything was going along quite nicely. And they were like a help you out type of group, non-smoking organization, and therapeutic, you know, healing, and like a spiritual group.
Rock, in that period of time, managed to convince his followers that he was some kind of latter-day Moses. And he began to kind of preach to his followers and present himself as some kind of an Old Testament prophet, which gave him an enormous power over the people that had gathered around him.
To the outside observer, of which there were very few, Rock exercised his power to keep Gabrielle and the others working long hours, even when they should have been sleeping.
not having even time to be able to think about what was really going on there. Because this is a technique that he used, that because he don't want us to even to think.
Their diet consisted of nothing much more than the raw vegetables they grew themselves.
So we were like physically breaking down.
People started to throw around a word like a cult. They all seem to be doing exactly what he says and only what he says.
It's sexual also control. He has a control on sexual life also.
Rock was also brilliant at setting up a kind of a competition among his quote-unquote wives and followers. So he might decide to make this particular woman his favorite for a few days, and the others would immediately respond by trying to ingratiate themselves.
Military generals call it divide and conquer. He split his tribe into two groups, with one of them clearly his favorite.
I was in the second group, the low-class group. We don't have no right to say anything, to be against anything. We have to accept what is going on, no matter what. And if you don't accept, what are going to be punished?
Worked, starved, ostracized, ignored. Rock's disciples quickly discovered that their utopia was no democracy. But they had no choice but to keep it to themselves.
Because the thing is, you're not getting people who are standing up in the middle of a session and saying, excuse me, Rock, I don't tend to agree with the kind of position we're taking.
What happens when you eliminate the social norms that govern everyday reality? For one thing, it becomes a jungle out there where the weakest among us die.
Look at our world and just tilt it over, I say, a few degrees over, and they're functioning with a logic within their own reality system. It's then a question of understanding what's their reality system, because there's an internal logic to the group. It just from the outside obviously looks hard to understand. One former member, I remember, told me, and it was kind of an interesting way of analyzing Thériault, you came to know when you could do certain things or how he would behave, and she told me it all depended on the weather. And what do you mean by the weather? Well, when it was nice, he was in a good mood, and when it wasn't nice, or it was raining, or the weather was bad, he drank. And when he drank, you never knew what he would do.
Ross Laver wrote an expose about Thériault called Savage Messiah, in which he examines Rock's childhood for signs of a latent killer.
His father was a very, very militant conservative Catholic belonging to a sect called the White Berets. And partly as a result of that, Rock grew up hating the Catholic Church, and he became attracted to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, in part because the Seventh-day Adventist Church stressed a lot of things that Rock had started to become very interested in, like natural foods, cessation of smoking, no drinking, and so on and so forth. And he was recruited by the church in part because he proved to be an absolutely brilliant salesperson. And so he very quickly emerged as kind of one of their star door-to-door salesmen and evangelists.
But church officials soon became uncomfortable with his magnetic personality and with the crowds that this upstart was attracting to his sermons.
He said that he had gifts, that he met God, he experienced God in his life, and he had visions, and as he was very bright, he was able to really he was able to avoid any suspicion from me. I really believe.
Rock's disciples weren't alone in mistaking him for a man of God.
At one point, at the urging of the parents of a number of Rock's followers, he was taken into custody, taken to a major hospital in Quebec City, and held for a psychiatric examination. When that examination ended, the head of psychiatry at the hospital called a news conference in the hospital and told the media that Rock Thériault was a shining example of a kind of a back to the land, a wonderful man, a man of God, and it's such a terrible thing that the police would be subjecting him to this harassment.
The hospital staff didn't just believe in Thériault. They sent him a mental patient to recuperate in his Gaspé Garden of Eden. Rock put him in charge of the children. But who was looking out for him?
Apparently the baby that he was looking after, one of them, would not stop crying. Cried and cried and cried. And he beat this child to make it stop crying. Well, he beat it into a coma. And when Rock and the women came back, I don't know what they did to him, but Rock's decision on how to make this baby better was to circumcise him.
Nurse Gabrielle must have seemed to everyone the obvious choice to perform the operation, but not to Rock Thériault.
He really thought that he was gifted, that God gifted him, of that ability to do operations, to do surgeries. But when Rock, played the doctor, he was Frankenstein.
The baby died on Dr. Frankenstein's kitchen table, not from loss of blood, but from alcohol poisoning, poured down its little throat as an anesthetic. Rock then decided to operate on the mental patient. The misfit escaped, but not before Rock had castrated him. Thériault was arrested on charges relating to the death of the child and the castration. He was convicted of criminal negligence and sent to jail. As for the commune, it was ordered to disband.
And to think that they regrouped again, and more children died and more women were killed. It's just... But they actually duped people. They made people believe that they were just wanting to have this nice little lifestyle.
For 2 brutal operations, which he was entirely unqualified to perform, the homeopathic guru who called himself Moses found himself behind bars. David Wolfe is an expert on sociopathic behavior, the kind that allows a person to suffer delusions of grandeur.
It's what we call megalomania. It's a real belief that you have all the answers. So there's definitely a personality disorder in there. That's something usually started in childhood. Our best understanding of such individuals is they grew up typically in very controlling households. Someone who has a lot of charismatic features, but also a healthy dose of paranoia and suspicion, and wants to lead people to believe that if you drop the old way of looking at the world and take on my view, that you'll really see the light.
For the next 14 months, Thériault could only shine his eerie light from prison. Some commune members decided 4 years of abuse were enough and fled. But the rest of the family, including Gabrielle, remained mysteriously under his spell.
And Rock was phoning us very often from the jail, even me, of the second group, the low class group, saying that I was special and everything, and that he loved me so much. And then when we leave the jail, it will be totally different than it was before. We're going to live in peace. We were ready for that step, and saying that we're all very great human beings and don't leave him. So that's why the group stayed together.
When Thériault was released, a dozen hardcore believers were prepared to give their master another chance. They headed west to Ontario, into dense bush country north of Toronto. Here was a place even more remote, 4 miles away from the nearest town of Burnt River, where screams would surely never be heard.
We have to roll up our sleeves and work and work and work to build up in a matter of no time. It's incredible.
Gabrielle would soon be forced to endure worse torture than hard work. The 2 children she had by Rock were taken from her to be raised by his favored women.
Not being able to love my children, that was the worst thing that a man could have done to me. He could have killed me. If God did not give me that spiritual strength, I would have never be able to go through that. Impossible. Impossible.
Rock, as I say, just seemed to be kind of a natural-born manipulator of people, somebody who knew instinctively how to break down somebody's defenses, want them to follow him, and do exactly what he said.
Why would a dozen seemingly sane people volunteer themselves into slavery? Our impulse is to call them all crazy. But Mike Gottfeld suggests that's too easy an answer.
Can't write them off as kooks because they aren't. You know, as strange or, weird as it may be perceived by the outside, I think it does, I think it's a totally wrong track to take to start with believing that these people are just, crazy.
Deprived of her children, Gabrielle would rationalize it as part of a greater logic, a sacrifice that they were all making for God.
Thinking of even leaving this is like, going back to what? The humdrum of everyday life. Here I am, part of God's force that's creating a better world or trying to create a better world. What can be better than that?
Manson had a very similar dynamic. He did the same thing. He just mixed in drugs as a spiritual thing. But it is a way of gradually being converted to his way of looking at the world. And that is, if they're the enemy, if you tell other people, then I'll be taken away from you, or you'll be taken away from me, your kids will be taken away from you. Your life as you know it will be destroyed. I'm keeping that at bay. So they become all powerful.
The sacrifice became almost too much for Gabrielle, the day her own child could not be consoled.
At one point, either to punish Gabrielle or to punish this baby for crying, Rock ordered that the child be left wrapped in a flimsy blanket in a wheelbarrow outside. It was the middle of winter. The temperature was -10 or -15 degrees, and left there for several hours. When the child was next checked, it was dead.
The official explanation was crib death. The authorities bought it, so why shouldn't Gabrielle? To save her sanity.
My son died in 1985, January 26, 1985, from crib death syndrome at the age of 5 months and 12 days. And I'm sure that he died from that because I have all the medical paper concerning his death.
You want to think he's crazy, but it was also, there was intent, and he knew what he was doing. Part of the craziness is to capture it in that mystical belief that I have these powers, and also to make it difficult for others to understand. Only you understand my powers, and know how powerful I am, and so that creates that whole mystery around the person.
Rock kept fathering children with his 8 concubines. If the kids were exceptionally well behaved, his methods of disciplining them might explain why.
According to some of the people who were there, he might take that child, hold it up against a tree trunk, and drive in knives on the clothes of the child to pin it against the tree, and then go to the mother of that child and say, I want you to throw these rocks at your children. And if she refused to do it, he would threaten to hurt the child even worse.
Because of their remote location, Thériault could continue his campaign of terror with impunity. But that very same isolation was piquing the public's curiosity about who these gentle people were.
I was a journalist working for the Fenelon Falls Gazette. And I had just been sent by my publisher to cover a story. He wanted to find these people who everyone was talking about in the community, this group who had moved on to this acreage out in the middle of nowhere, and no one seemed to be able to find them. So he made it my job to find them.
Most of the press coverage that they got was extremely favorable because, of course, when they would visit, Rock would be on his best behavior. If they had a visitor at the commune, they would always put on a big banquet, a lavish dinner, lots of food. So, of course, nobody had the impression that people were being starved or mistreated. Would look to the outside world as if not only were they being well fed, but also that they were growing their own food, they were baking their own bread. This sort of picture of this alternative community really appealed to a lot of people.
Reporter Debbie Vilaka found herself in densely wooded country without a compass.
There was no apparent entrance to the property. Nobody really knew exactly where the entrance was. So I went out one day and just sort of scouted along the concession lines and started to follow in a few of the like logging roads. I had gone in quite a while and I was just walking. All of a sudden, shots were fired and bullets were hitting the trees above where I was walking. And so I just sort of like crouched down to the ground and I started hollering like, hey, you know, there's people here, there's someone here. My reaction when it happened, it wasn't like fear, it was anger. And it was like, hey, you know, quit shooting. But then my second reaction was, this is crazy. I gotta get out of here.
For reporter Debbie Vilaka, a feel-good story about a band of holistic Christians living on the land had suddenly turned into a dangerous assignment. She returned to the bush country north of Toronto, this time in a four-wheel drive vehicle, accompanied by another reporter.
So we, you know, followed these old farmers' logging roads and went over creeks and through bush. And by the time we actually reached the settlement that they were in, it was dark.
They were met by two of Rock's women, who weren't expecting guests for dinner.
They were very agitated. Like they were not weak women at all. They weren't saying, you know, oh, what are you doing here? You know, they were like, what are you doing here? Who are you?
They issued a warning that Rock would be upset, but Debbie didn't flinch. She had questions that needed answers. Escorted into the main building, Debbie encountered 12 young children sitting at a long table.
It was silent. There wasn't a sound. They didn't fidget. They didn't talk. They didn't cry. Like, it was very odd. And then Rock came in.
As he began speaking, Debbie had only one thought on her mind.
How is it possible that this man has convinced all of these women to live with him as his wives and to have all of these children?
But her interview would have to wait, while he continued speaking in grandiose metaphors.
He was very philosophical. He said, if you go downstream, he said the waters are muddy, and from people walking through it and drinking from it and messing it up. He said, but by coming to the source of the river, he says that the water is clean. And he said, by coming to the source, you've come to me, and so you've come to the truth. I thought it was like, this is like a con man. That was my, you know, reaction to it. Like, this is how a con man would talk to you.
Rock's sermonizing may have mesmerized his disciples, but it only made Debbie more anxious to speak up.
And I asked him about having 7 wives. And he said that they were not wives in the conventional sense. They weren't married. He basically said the relationship was the women love me and I love them. And it's an agreement. And babies come. It's only natural.
It may have been natural, but to Debbie, his explanation wasn't sincere.
He wasn't like serious. Do you know what I mean? If you're having a serious conversation with somebody and they're just direct and they say, you know, I'm glad you've come to talk to me because now I can tell you the straight story. He wasn't like that.
The reporters were politely escorted back to civilization. But for cult members who wanted to leave, it wasn't that simple.
You were isolated. It wasn't just easy like packing your bags or slipping out in the middle of the night and just disappearing. It was hard to get away, physically hard. And if you're somewhere like in the places they were in the middle of the winter, you're not just picking up and walking out. You know, in some cases, it was hard to go anywhere, let alone thinking of leaving.
One concubine did manage to escape and reported Rock's brutality. Authorities stormed the place and removed most of the children. If adults thought their lives were in danger, and they were, they didn't say a word.
As the social workers went around from person to person, they were told, if you want your child or your children, you simply have to come with us, leave Rock Terrio, leave Moses, and you'll be allowed to keep your children. But if you decide to stay with Rock, then your child will be put up, or your children will be put up for adoption. Not a single mother left Rock. They stayed with him.
We have to keep in mind that most people would look at this externally and think, why wouldn't you say something? Why wouldn't people do anything? Why wouldn't you rebel? Well, that's often because gradually, little by little, that's been stripped from you, the feeling you even have a choice.
At that time, we were not human beings anymore. We even cannot think properly, because what you go through is fear. Fear. Second after second, minute after minute, hour after hour, for years.
With his children gone, Rock decided someone had to pay. He singled out a scapegoat, one of his more strong-minded women, Solange Boulard. He dragged her into the forest.
And when I heard, it was a horror. And when she came back, she was, covered with blues and in a very pitiful state. And he told us because the devil was in her, and he had to get rid of the devil in her.
Unconvinced that Solange's spirit had been purged, Rock ordered her to undergo one of his kitchen table surgeries. For Solange, there would be no escape, and no report to authorities. In fact, it wouldn't be discovered for almost a year that Solange Boulard was dead.
What she was going through, she was going through something. I could feel that. I just couldn't describe it because she was, her belly was open. And here she was in that state of calm, of peace. And that really impressed me.
How could a spiritual movement descend to such depths of depravity? Mike Kopfeld puts himself in Gabrielle's shoes.
So now if I'm watching you being beaten, I'm sitting there going, phew, I'm glad it's not me. I'm not going, why is she being beaten? And I got to find some way to stop this because this is horrific. I'm going, I'm glad that's not me. And so it's very different. So one is looking out also for one's own interest on one level at the same time as finding a way to justify that was warranted because she wasn't doing what God wanted, or she was somebody who was too selfish, or she was somebody who gossiped too much or didn't do what she was supposed to do.
A constant state of denial turned these grown men and women into children, and worse.
We don't have no power, no possibility to think anymore. As I said, we are zombies. We're not human beings anymore. We are like zombies.
Now people assume, well, this is all well planned out. This is not planned out. You see, that's the whole thing that people sometimes forget, is they think that this is, all planned out. But it's a process that goes on, and it's only when we talk about it by stepping back and trying to look at how the group evolves that we can see certain kind of processes going on. And in the case of, let's say, Terrio, you can see that because he could do what he wanted and no one reacted against it, what was to stop him from going further?
Nothing. Not even Gabrielle Lavallee, for whom it did go a lot further.
Gabrielle had been getting on his nerves for some reason. He decided that she needed to be taught a lesson. He grabbed one of her hands, forced it down to their big wooden kitchen table, and took a knife and stabbed through the hand, basically sort of crucified her hand to the table.
Believe me, I was sure that I would die that night. I was really certain I would die.
Over a 12-year period, Roch Thériault had 22 children with 8 different women. With most of the kids removed from the premises, Roch found other, almost cannibalistic ways to feed his ego.
He was asking to his concubines to write him letters. And we have to praise him, and I had a hard time with that. So we wanted to make an example, you know, saying to the others, if you are stubborn like she is, you're going to through what she's going through now.
She was already suffering a broken arm that had become infected.
He grabbed one of her hands, forced it down to their big wooden kitchen table, and took a knife and stabbed through the hand, basically sort of crucified her hand to the table so that she was unable to move with this knife going right through her hand.
I saw the whole scene, but I didn't have no feeling, no fear.
Took a carpet knife, sort of those hooked, curved carpet knife, and again, with Gabrielle unable to move, he held her arm and started carving away pieces of the flesh over a period of an hour or two, just carving them away like he was whittling a log or something like that.
What I went through, I was in God's presence. I was surrounded by God's love so much. It was so great what I went through.
Not so great that her arm was being brutally amputated, but great that the God she turned her back on 12 years earlier had returned and was speaking to her.
This is when I realized that was the key sentence when he said, I love you. I heard him telling me, I love you. That was the key sentence that helped me to open the psychological jail, to recover my critical judgment, and then to realize that this guy who said was the representative of God wasn't at all. It was the devil. I saw the devil.
Gabrielle survived the mutilation, then waited 19 days for the right moment to escape. It was August 14th, 1989.
That's my freedom day. It's as important as my birthday.
She beat her own trail through dense bush country to Burnt River. At the hospital, the doctor thought it was a miracle she was alive. The psychological damage of a dozen years in captivity began immediately to heal.
There were 2 men, my surgeon and the chief police. They were 2 very nice human beings that really, really, really helped me. Those men helped me to reconcile with all men. You know, being able to make the difference that if I had something to blame, it was just a person, not all the men, for what happened to me.
The manhunt for Roch Thériault lasted 6 weeks. When he was arrested, 3 of his wives remained at his side. But for the others, the spell was broken, and they testified in court against him. Roch was tried for the murder of Solange Boulard and 84 different counts of brutality. The jury found him guilty.
People who do this, men who do this, I know of no treatment. If it was established early and discovered early in adolescence that they were, becoming abusive towards girlfriends and wanted to have their own followers and things, they could probably get help at that point. But someone who is now well into a criminal pattern of this, and given that it's a personality disorder, very difficult to treat. You can only control it by monitoring and perhaps incarceration.
With Roch Thériault behind bars, people began asking how a man of God could have become so ungodly. Gabrielle blames booze for the decline of Moses.
Even though sometimes he was like regretting what he was doing and become sober again, well, it was just as awful. Even when he was sober, he became worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
Maybe the more important part of this story is why were all of these people attracted to him in the first place, and how did they become his followers, and why had they stayed together for, at that time, about 12 years?
Often when one looks at groups of this kind, people have often said, well, the people were brainwashed. Yeah, I mean, it's really what it goes on. I don't think it's anything magical. So it's not magical in the sense of like, there's no magical technique where I don't have to look you in the eyes and I zap you and you're gone. It's that process. We can approach, let's say, 100 people and maybe only get 5 or 6 or 7 to become more interested and involved, because the other people we're approaching are saying, well, okay, interesting, but not for me, thank you, goodbye. The same way as you may have the professional con artist that goes, door to door or business to business to try to defraud somebody. Is he able to defraud everyone? No.
If Gabrielle fell too easily for the spiritual seduction, it was due to the desire to bring meaning to her life. But even in the early going, she had a feeling that her quest for salvation would have a dark side.
It's like he was able to really look inside of me with this look and see all of my weaknesses, that he said to himself, I'm going to use that to break her down. And I'm sure at that point he said she will be the easiest one to break down.
Gabrielle Lavallée took years to accept the mistake of falling for a false prophet. In the tradition of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, she rose from the ashes to write an exposé on Roch Thériault. Writing about her 12 lost years proved to be the best therapy.
Through my writings, I relived that hell again, but allowing my emotions, though, to really go through all of that, because when I was with Thériault, I just couldn't show my emotions.
She took her book show on the road, to schools and women's groups. Her message was about happiness.
It is not out there. We have to find it in ourselves. It's there. Everything is there to fulfill ourselves. So when we reject ourselves, well, our spiritual life, when we decide to live only on a human will, oh la la.
Gabrielle can testify about willpower. It's not always the captain of our fate. As David Wolfe explains, it's not that difficult to convince people to believe in you.
If I wanted to do that tomorrow, I would find something I thought people needed. And it's usually some basic emotion. They need affection and love and attention and resources. And I would provide that to them, and I would little by little block out the other stuff that they have and convince them that this is better for them. And one day they wake up and realize they're totally controlled by it but can't get out.
Roch Thériault has served 15 years behind bars and is now eligible for parole. But he recently declined a hearing. He said he fears for his life if set free. For Gabrielle, life has never been better, especially since finding the daughter she lost to adoption.
I never thought I would see my daughter again. I was sure I would never see her again. So, in 1989, August 14, I leave for good. And then I make sure to contact her adoptive family, and as they are great human beings with a great heart, they allow me to see her again.
Gabrielle was anxious that her 6-year-old daughter might be traumatized by painful memories.
But I have to play strong, I mean, that was not easy. Very, very, very emotional. When I arrived at her place, finally, when I gave up clothes and a teddy bear, I just, embrace her adoptive mother and allow myself to cry there.
Tears of gratitude that helped Gabrielle come to terms with a memory of one very bad man.
There is always a bit of light in the darkness. And we have to kind of hope on that, to get out of that of darkness, because there is always light at the end of the tunnel of our human misery. Always. Never give up. Never, 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 never give up.